Hi, I'm Catherine. I work for Youth of Christ, and I'm going to tell you today about my favourite Bible hero, who is called Ruth. She lived at a really important time in history. It was actually quite violent, but she lived at a time when Israel were run by judges, which were kind of like regional governors. And they didn't have a king at the time. And Ruth herself wasn't actually an Israelite. She lived in a country called Moab. And her husband's family actually moved to Moab because Israel was going through a famine. So she gets married, she's living with her husband and a mother-in-law and father-in-law, and she has a sister-in-law and a brother-in-law as well. And about 10 years later, her father-in-law has died, and her husband's died, and her brother-in-law has died. And that's really difficult for Naomi, her mother-in-law, for Ruth and for her sister-in-law, because in those days, women actually had no support if they weren't married. So it made life really, really difficult for them. So Naomi tells her two daughters-in-law to go back home to their mothers, to go and live with their families again, and she's going to go back home to Israel. But Ruth actually decides that she's going to go with Naomi, and she says something really important to her. She says, "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." And so she makes an active choice to go with Naomi and to follow God, who's the God of Israel, something which she wasn't naturally brought up to do. So they go back to Israel, and Ruth works really, really hard to support her mother-in-law, and she ends up going to work in a field of a man named Boaz. Well, Boaz is actually a close relative of Naomi, and in those days, male relatives had to support widows and their families, anybody who'd been left destitute. So she goes to work with him, and Naomi kind of encourages Ruth to sort of speak to Boaz and ask Boaz to marry her. And in those days, the closest male relative could actually marry a widow to provide for her and for her family. So if she has any more children, that would be a support for her and also for any of her relatives. So Ruth's really brave, and she asks Boaz to marry her, and he says yes. So they go ahead, and Ruth ends up having a son. And so Naomi ends up having a grandson who will look after her in her old age. Ruth is just really, really brave because she actually kind of sacrifices her own life and what she wants to go and help somebody else. But actually, God really blesses her in that, and he provides her with so much more. And so much so that she actually ends up being the great-grandmother of King David, who's Israel's greatest king. And she also ends up being in the ancestral line of Jesus himself, even though she's from a country who actually, she's not brought up to follow God, but she chooses to know him, to want to know him. And for me, that's really important because it sort of says to us that even if we haven't been brought up to know God, we can actually come to know him for ourselves. It doesn't matter what our family background is, he is for everyone, and you know, you can come to know him too.